The bane of many great pieces of art is that they often go unappreciated in their own time. I recently did a retrospective review of the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds, and while it is general consensus today that Pet Sounds is one of the greatest albums ever made, it received mixed reviews upon release. The album was not the typical surfer rock fare that was previously associated with the California group, and although history has been more kind to the album, many were disappointed with its more experimental direction at the time. It may seem strange to draw any kind of parallel between a rock/chamber pop album from 1966 and a video game from 2001, but when you look at the legacy of Metal Gear Solid 2 and how its place in the series and reputation among fans has grown and changed drastically over the last 2 decades, it becomes clear that these kinds of similarities can in fact extend across different mediums. Metal Gear Solid 2 is my favourite game in the series. Now admittedly, this has changed over the years, cycling between Metal Gear Solids 1, 2 and 3. But I landed on this entry in the series a number of years back, and it has remained my favourite ever since. My reasons for ranking it highest are numerous, and I will express my adoration for the game throughout this video. However, it should be noted that proclaiming Metal Gear Solid 2 as the best game in the series does not come without controversy. But before we get into why, let me give a quick synopsis of Metal Gear Solid 2's development history. After the critical and commercial success of Metal Gear Solid on the original PlayStation, a game I've reviewed in a previous video, Konami were eager to develop a sequel for the PlayStation 2, Sony's newest piece of gaming hardware, which came out at the turn of the 21st century. Ironically, Kojima had intended for Metal Gear Solid to be the final game in the series, wrapping up what would have been essentially a trilogy of Metal Gear games, spin-offs not included. So, bowing to company pressure, and most certainly his own creative desire to expand the Metal Gear lore, Kojima and his team set about making a sequel to the lauded PlayStation 1 classic. When we look at the most impactful game reveals in Electronic Entertainment Expo history, Metal Gear Solid 2 at the 2000 E3 show has to rank near the top. There's a great video on YouTube that shows people's immediate reaction to the trailer that's well worth watching. Firstly, it's amusing to see their awestruck reaction to the graphics of the demo, praising the water effects and fawning over its general realism. It's a nostalgic reminder of how impressive the technology of the PS2 and other 6th generation consoles were at the time. Secondly, it really emphasises the pre-existing hype that surrounded the game even prior to its official announcement. Metal Gear Solid, which is actually the 3rd game in the series, set a new standard in cinematic presentation and gameplay innovation when it was released on the PlayStation in 1998. Its stealth action, coupled with its enthralling narrative and phenomenal sound design, made it an instant classic and a global fan favourite, and is still to this day regarded as one of the best, and by many the best, PS1 games ever made. In every game review I've done so far, I've made a point to avoid divulging any major spoilers. I find that in most reviews and retrospectives of story-driven games, you can summarise it, highlighting its strengths and critiquing its weaknesses without ruining the plot entirely, which is what I've done in my previous 9 videos. However, in this instance, I'm going to have to make an exception. Not just because the story is as key an element in MGS2 as any other video game you could think of, but because retrospectively, so many of the game's themes and ideas actually resonate more today than they did over 20 years ago when the game was first released. I mean, even the game's main antagonist and setting were hidden from the public before its release, with journalists even sworn to silence when originally reviewing it in 2001. So Metal Gear Solid 2 was, in its original instance, shrouded in secrecy. So to fully analyse and appreciate the game, I'm going to have to spoil it. So if you haven't played it yet, and you should, I recommend turning off this video and getting your hands on a copy somehow. The game begins with a cutscene of a man walking along the Verrazano Bridge in New York City, wearing a big raincoat during a heavy downpour. Suddenly he picks up speed, taking off to a sprint. Discarding the raincoat, he leaps from the bridge, rappelling to a ship sailing directly below, as his stealth camouflage flickers on and off. Meanwhile, a Hollywood-worthy wall of sound orchestrates the experience, as a helicopter flies above, with a familiar face in it, watching the man's every move. As the man lands on the deck, his stealth camo fails, and it is revealed to be Solid Snake, who stares ahead into the storm as the game's title flashes behind him. The intent of this introduction is clear. If the first Metal Gear Solid game was the PS1's hardware catching up with Hideo Kojima's movie-inspired ambition, Metal Gear Solid 2 was Kojima attempting to create a genuinely cinematic experience, the video game equivalent of something that could stand up to the Hollywood action films of the early 2000s. And so far, at least with this introduction, he has succeeded. I've always felt that the most significant console generational leap was from the 5th to the 6th. Sure, the 5th generation consoles had 3D graphics, polyphonic music, voice acting, and increasingly dynamic gameplay. But the 6th generation really felt like the first time you were watching something which could feasibly be described as realistic. Models and facial animations were wholly recognisable, level designs were vast and detailed, gameplay was becoming increasingly more fluid, and sound design was even clearer and more dynamic. And you can tell that Kojima and Konami were willing and ultimately able to squeeze every ounce of power out of the new hardware to create a truly cinematic experience. For a game that was released in the PS2's infancy, Metal Gear Solid 2 looks better than it has any right to be. Now admittedly, some of the textures are a little blurry and some of the lines are noticeably jagged, but aside from that it holds up very well. The weather effects on the deck of the ship are a prime example of this. While the rain isn't wholly realistic, it pelts down in a way that is at least believable. And the splash effects and the shimmering surface of the deck are still impressive, and were downright incredible for the time. The facial models also hold up well, and while some of them can appear a little lifeless, prime examples of this including Sergei Galukovich, Fortune and Fatman, more on these later, they are still identifiably human and look well even now. I'll touch on other graphical elements as the review goes along, but suffices to say it still looks more than passable. However, where the game really shines in the visual department, as well as in many others, is the presentation. The cutscenes in this game set a new industry standard, as did the first MGS in its day, but the execution here is simply on another level. The next cutscene, which shows a group of Russian soldiers commandeer the ship, taking out all the Marines on deck, is a prime example of this. It also shows us Galukovich for the first time, looking extremely To Catch a Predator-ish, to be honest. The camera angles, choreography and editing, along with the music, are simply masterful. With a graphical update, this kind of cutscene wouldn't look out of place among the throng of modern cinematic video games. But back in 2001, there simply wasn't anything on the market that could touch it. Aside from the new setting and superior presentation, Metal Gear Solid 2 also prides itself, at least in the beginning, on instilling a sense of familiarity. The long codec conversation at the beginning, briefing Snake on the mission which, in this case, is getting photographic evidence of a new Metal Gear prototype on behalf of Philanthropy, an anti-Metal Gear NGO founded by Snake and Otacon, is reminiscent of the first Metal Gear Solid. The only difference is it's Otacon counselling Snake solo, without Campbell and Mei Ling and co. Even still, Otacon is a familiar face, being a prominent secondary character in the game. Although the voice acting and faces, well, they have actual faces now at least, are the same, there are subtle differences in their characters. While still a gruff soldier, Snake's character has softened slightly from the first game, evidenced by his gentler speaking tone and the fact that he's here on what is essentially a humanitarian mission, equipped with a silenced tranquilizer gun, more on that in a bit, as opposed to just simply being a soldier for hire. Otacon also has evolved. In the first game, he was a timid, somewhat naive genius who annoyed and endeared himself to Snake in equal measure. In this game, it is clear from the outset that a strong friendship has developed between the two, which has allowed Otacon to come out of his shell and develop a personality. The two banter back and forth, with Otacon afforded a little sass here and there, and Snake being able to laugh at himself. Almost. Much like with its presentation, the first Metal Gear Solid raised the bar in terms of its voice acting, and the continued evolution is evident here. However, where the game improved the most is in the scripting, which is much more natural, humorous, and just superiorly written. There would be suspect moments of dialogue later in the game, but for the most part, it's brilliantly written. Also familiar are the menus, meaning pause, game over, and weapons. The latter is just the weapon and item wheels that you can cycle through. The newest and most important addition to this is the aforementioned tranquilizer gun. Justified by Snake's general aversion to hurt or kill any of the Marines, it may just be the most important weapon ever introduced to the series. The Metal Gear series is, at its core, stealth-based, where evasion is rewarded and needless confrontation punished. Giving Snake a non-lethal pistol, which puts enemies to sleep, both makes the game easier to navigate through, while simultaneously adding a tactical element to the series. Before, Snake could only attempt to sneak past enemies by judging their movements, while the only non-lethal means of engaging enemies was limited to a close-quarters judo throw and rear-naked choke. But with the tranquilizer gun, Snake can pick off enemies without killing them, which would, were they found, result in an alert stage. The game also keeps it somewhat challenging by making the gun a slow semi-automatic and giving it a tiny laser sight. It also takes a long time for it to kick in if you don't land a perfect headshot. Also, unlike in previous Metal Gear games, a downed enemy, dead or otherwise, doesn't just evaporate after being neutralized. This means that Snake has to dispose of the body should he not wish to be found. You can do this by hiding them behind objects, throwing them overboard, or, most commonly, in storage lockers. This again added a tactical element to the game, which logistically would have been impossible to execute on the PS1. The tanker may be my favourite location in any Metal Gear game. One of the things I like most about it is how linear it is. Linearity has become something of a dirty word in video game vernacular in recent years, but in certain games it just works. And this is a great example of this. A tanker is supposed to be somewhat cramped and claustrophobic, and that works really well in the context of a stealth game. Sure, the idea is evasion, but the game also wants to make said evasion more challenging, and a good way to do this is to trap Snake in a cramped environment with enemy soldiers. This forces players to be more cerebral, as recklessly running through the ship's exposed exteriors or tight interiors will certainly mean you'll be discovered. Like in the first game, being discovered triggers an alert phase, which essentially means you'll be bombarded by wave after wave of enemies until you're killed or you successfully hide for a period of time. It's in these moments that we can see the technological advancements of the series at their most overt. In MGS1, random NPCs would just appear and attempt to shoot at Snake, making it easy to simply hide and wait for the relatively short alert phase to die down. In MGS2, however, multiple backup soldiers will arrive in a coordinated blitz, often wielding shields and heavier firepower. There are also 3 alert phases this time: alert, evasion, and caution. Not only does this mean that Snake has to stay hidden for longer, but he better find a good hiding spot, such as a locker. The backup soldiers will also search for Snake in realistic formations, checking corners and clearing potential hiding places before calling off the search. Kojima had a military consultant work with him for MGS2, and it really shows in everything from these attacks to how Snake carries his own weapons and everything. As you make your way through the tight hallways and common areas, you eventually find your way to the captain's steer and the upper deck. This is where you encounter the first boss battle in the game. A woman, revealed to be Olga Gerlukovich, daughter of Sergei, is on a walkie-talkie communicating to her father, who orders her off the ship. She wants to stay and fight, but he reminds her that she is pregnant with his grandchild and demands she get a chopper out of there. Snake attempts to hold her up, which leads to their encounter. This is similar to the Revolver Ocelot fight from MGS1, in that it is a one-on-one handgun duel. However, as with most things in MGS2, it feels like an updated version of that fight. For one, you have to pop into first person in order to accurately hit Olga. Also, you can only use the tranquilizer gun, which reinforces the idea that enemies, including bosses, can now be incapacitated through non-lethal means. Olga also pulls little tricks on Snake to make the encounter more challenging, such as obscuring Snake's vision with tarps and blinding him with spotlights. All of these nuances show off the technical advancements the game has made. And while I can say with a degree of certainty that this fight was deliberately designed to mimic the first Ocelot encounter, I'll elaborate on that at the end of the video. I am unsure if these tweaks were done to display the advancements purposely, or if it was unintentional, and just happened to be the way it was imagined and conceived. Either way, with Olga now taking a nap, Snake picks up her SOCOM pistol and resumes his mission to find Metal Gear. You make your way down to the engine room, which is populated by more soldiers. From there you disable some C4 and make your way to the port, another claustrophobic corridor. Here, lights can be shot out and pipes can be hid behind in order to evade oncoming enemies. The first mini-boss occurs here too, with Snake taking on a slew of Gorlukovich's men. It's a decent encounter, but far from spectacular, and essentially amounts to a railgun shooting section. Afterwards, Snake exits the area and a cutscene is triggered, showing Revolver Ocelot, yes, that Revolver Ocelot lurking from the helicopter, assassinating one of Gorlukovich's soldiers. The next section is one of the most fun and unique moments in the entire game. Snake takes a ladder down to a giant, tree-roomed hangar in the bottom of the ship. The far room is housing Metal Gear and the Marine Commandant, Scott Dolph, who's giving a speech to a small group of Marines about the importance of Metal Gear and the Marines' responsibility in preventing nuclear war. The other two rooms are filled with row after row of Marines. What makes this section so much fun is manoeuvring Snake through all of these soldiers undetected, and the various methods in which you can do this. One of the biggest differences between Metal Gear Solids 1 and 2 is the verticality of the level design. Obviously, with more powerful hardware comes more dynamic level design, but this is the first clear-cut example of it in the game. While you will most likely take the low path to get to Metal Gear, you do have the option to go along the balconies at certain points. You need to have your grip strength at certain levels to do this, more on grip strength and a whole load of other Easter eggs later. But it's nice to have the option to navigate this section on two different levels. Using the most conventional method, Snake will simply have to sneak past the throng of Marines on the floor. Aside from the one standing at attention, Snake has patrolling soldiers, projector lights and noisy floor grates to contend with. As I said, this is one of the most enjoyable parts of the game, and is also perhaps one of the moments that best summarises the tagline tactical espionage action in the entire series. Upon arriving to the Metal Gear hangar, Snake must take pictures of the Metal Gear, including the Marine insignia, and send them to Otacon. When he does this, Dolph wraps up the speech, when he is ambushed by Ocelot and Gorlukovich. Gorlukovich informs the Commandant that he intends to steal the Metal Gear as a step in re-establishing Mother Russia as a dominant superpower. Ocelot, however, informs them both that he intends to return the bipedal war machine to the Patriots. They're both aghast, and Ocelot shoots both men and hops in the machine. Just then, his arm, which has been cut off by Cyborg Ninja in the previous game and is clearly being replaced, starts to spaz out, and it is revealed that it is the arm of Liquid Snake. But more on all that nonsense later. Liquid, or Ocelot, then tears through the ship, launching into the air and away as Snake and the rest of the Marines have all presumably drowned. If it feels like I'm rushing through this section of the game, it's because, well, I am. I'm doing this for 3 reasons. 1, to keep the video under 2 hours. 2, because I want to contrast both sections of the game. And 3, because I feel certain plot and gameplay elements can be explained and critiqued more effectively while looking at later portions of the campaign. At the conclusion of what would go on to be known as the tanker incident, we cut to what feels almost like a parody of the beginning of Metal Gear Solid 1. A man in scuba gear is swimming through murky waters as the familiar voice of Colonel Campbell briefs him on his mission, even referring to him as Snake. However, instead of Shadow Moses, you're infiltrating the Big Shell, an offshore decontaminating facility built on the site of the sunken tanker. You're informed by the Colonel that a fringe terrorist organisation named Dead Cell has taken over the facility and taken the US President, among others, as hostage. They're demanding $30 billion or they'll blow up the Big Shell, killing everyone including the President. Aside from that, the destruction of the Big Shell will release toxins into the water, causing the biggest environmental disaster in history, so no pressure. When you surface, you find yourself in the pump facility in Strut A of the Big Shell. More in the struts later on. You walk into an area next to a large loading elevator populated by 2 enemies. However, as you arrive, both of them have already been knocked unconscious by a not too mysterious man. Your next goal is to access the node. Nodes are computers which are located in every strut and every main area in the Big Shell. You have to log into each node to get access to the radar, or map, in that area. Some find this an annoyance, but I actually quite enjoy it. I think it adds an extra challenge to the game while making some of its less than exciting areas more interesting. Logging into the first node, which includes you adding your name, birthday and nationality, a very late 90s, early 2000s kind of feature in a game if I ever saw one. Raiden is initially shocked by the computer, probably due to the fact that it has to sync with your nanomachines to activate. As they regain consciousness, you're forced to hide while waiting for the elevator to arrive. The parallels to MGS1 are obvious here too, and there is a plot explanation for this which is revealed towards the end of the game. Playing it for the first time though, gamers would just have assumed that it was designed that way to create a sense of familiarity to returning players while reinforcing the aesthetic for newer ones. One of the most notable things about the part of the game is the increased intensity from the first game. As I mentioned, alert phases last much longer in MGS2, and guards move with more realism and attack with more lethality. However, the music during these phases also adds a great deal to the tension. Personally, I prefer the score from the first game, but there is no doubt that the music composed by Harry Gregson Williams and Norihiko Hibino was done so with more of an emphasis on theme and mood in mind. The first game's music was more emotional and for me is just more pleasing to the ear, but MGS2's music definitely has more nuance and helps increase the atmosphere significantly in certain situations. With only a relatively exposed pile of boxes to hide behind, the player must sneak past the guards to get to the elevator. Doing this requires patience and timing, and it reinforces the sense of claustrophobia and urgency set in place during the tanker mission. When you make it to the elevator, our new protagonist's identity is revealed the same way that Snake's was in MGS1. Our new boy, now codenamed Raiden, has his name changed almost as quickly as it was given to him, is revealed, and this is where the similarities to Snake end. Whereas Snake is a wily veteran with over a decade of field experience and a bedrock of confidence and wisdom, Raiden is a fresh-faced rookie out on his first mission, who not only lacks the experience of Snake, but lacks his calm and self-assuredness too. Raiden is also informed that the leader of Dead Cell and the terrorist takeover refers to himself as Solid Snake, hence the name change. Metal Gear Solid 2 is over 2 decades old now, so the existence of Raiden as the main protagonist is simply common knowledge today, but it's difficult to explain just how jarring this was to players upon release. The first Metal Gear Solid game was an established PlayStation classic and was beloved among the mainstream gaming masses and hardcore fans alike. Solid Snake was a key ingredient of the game's success, and is still one of the most beloved video game characters today. When people saw the trailer and the demos for the sequel, they were almost ravenous in their desire to get their hands on a copy and lead Snake through another adventure. When it was revealed, again only by actually playing the game, that not only was Snake not the main protagonist, but that he may be dead and his successor was an effeminate looking rookie, fans' reaction ranged from confused to enraged. Time has been more kind to MGS2 and Raiden, but at the time people were genuinely pissed and felt like they had been hoodwinked by Kojima, which, in essence, they had been, and it was by design. At this point in the game we've just completed the tanker, which is awesome but essentially just a lengthy prologue, and begun the main mission. But already the game has thrown a lot of plot and mystery at us. So much so that it seems extensive even for a Metal Gear game. This is the game essentially priming you for what is to come. And if things feel weird or overwhelming now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Anyway, once the cutscene ends, you find yourself on the roof of Strut A. The big shell is made up of 2 structures, shells 1 and 2, connected together by a bridge. Each shell is made up of 6 struts connected together in a hexagon shape with a core section in the middle, all of which are connected by bridges. The shell is indicative of one of the biggest presentation strengths in the game, as well as one of its weaknesses. Metal Gear Solid 2 looks remarkably good for its age. As I said, some of the character models look a little Avatar-ish, and obviously it wouldn't hold up to games of today, but looking at it in motion, it still runs incredibly smooth. And smooth is the key word. Texturally, the game just looks great. I think a big reason for this is the bland colour palette and the simplistic structure. This may sound like a negative, but it actually gives the game an almost ageless feeling that is normally preserved for 2D side-scrollers and cel-shaded games. It's as close to timeless as a game grounded in reality can be. The entire big shell has this kind of beige hue, And again, this is both an advantage and a detriment. It's advantageous due to the reasons I just mentioned. Also, the game upon release was set in the not too distant future, in the year 2009, which is hilarious looking back now in 2022. So it helps to establish a kind of clean, postmodern vibe too. The disadvantage of this kind of design and colour scheme is that there is very little visual diversity in the main section of the game. In reflection, this is perhaps the tanker's biggest contribution to the game, aside from setting up the story. Had the entire game been set on the big shell, it may have had been a little boring and repetitive, moving from one strut to the next. But because the memory of the stormy tanker is still fresh in our minds as we play through the big shell, it doesn't feel like Konami just did a lot of copying and pasting for the big shell, which, if we're being honest, I'm sure they did in actuality. Fortunately, in spite of the repetitive nature of the big shell, moving through it is as smooth as the graphics themselves, and is actually a lot of fun. Even though the struts and connecting bridges follow an identical pattern, each one has different interior layout from the next. The first strut and connecting bridge between that strut and strut B are the most basic, and serve as a nice way to ease the player into navigating it. Each connecting bridge is populated by soldiers or enemy ciphers, which makes going from each strut more challenging. The first bridge is simply a two-pronged one with a soldier on each end, making picking them off or sneaking past them relatively easy, utilising sneaking in throws, hanging from the ledge and shimmering, or, should you locate it early, picking them off with a tranquilizer gun. However, each subsequent connecting bridge will serve up a bigger challenge for the player. This is where the dynamic game design really gets a chance to show off, as Raiden can be spotted by enemy soldiers up on rooftops, or ciphers flying through the sky. There are also two story connecting bridges, which not only make enemy patrols more unpredictable, but give Raiden more options on how to deal with said enemies. When you make your way to Strut B, it immediately triggers a cutscene which is reminiscent of Cyborg Ninja annihilating the soldiers from the first Metal Gear Solid game. A group of Navy SEALs are being picked apart by what appears to be some kind of supernatural vampire. Once again, the cutscene work here is incredible, and not only showcases the influence of late 90s, early 2000s action movies like The Matrix and Blade on Kojima's directing style, but also just how far ahead of the game he was at this time. Raiden is saved from having his throat cut by a nomadic soldier who reveals himself to be Lieutenant Pliskin. However, we all recognise him as Solid Snake, alive and well. Raiden informs Pliskin, that although he has no field experience, he has completed extensive virtual reality training. This is voiced over a cutscene depicting the playable VR missions in the Metal Gear Solid 1 Special Missions expansion pack. A virtual grunt for the digital age is what Snake refers to Raiden as, before quipping, "War is a video game. What better way to raise the ultimate soldier?" A seemingly throwaway comment which will have greater significance later on. Two more cutscenes and a handful of codec conversations occur within quick succession as you make your way from Strut B to C. The most prominent codec conversation occurs between Raiden and Rose, the woman in charge of saving Raiden's progress, who also happens to be his girlfriend, who immediately quizzes him on the significance of tomorrow, hinting at some kind of anniversary. But like a true alpha bro, Raiden has no idea what the hell she is talking about. Her appearance at this stage feels a little strange, but will make sense at the game's conclusion. Her presence also helps to emphasise Raiden as a rookie soldier. She brings tenderness, frustration, bashfulness, and other such emotions out of him. The kind of emotions that experienced soldiers like Snake learn to tamper during missions. The first cutscene introduces the second member of Dead Cell, Fortune. Donning a trench coat and a giant electrical railgun, she wipes out another crew of Navy SEALs, none of whom can hit her with gunfire. It makes for another impressive cutscene, but is a relatively brief and underwhelming introduction, especially when compared to Vamp. The second cutscene is much less brief and of far more immediate consequence. Arriving at Strut C, Raiden runs into Pliskin once more, who is with Peter Stillman. Stillman is a bomb disposal expert who retired after failing to dispose of a bomb at a church, which killed multiple people and left him with a prosthetic. He was brought out of retirement to help dispose of the bombs planted on the Big Shell by Fat Man, the third member of Dead Cell. Stillman was Fat Man's mentor and taught him everything he knows about bomb making, and thus feels a moral impetus to to aid in defusing his explosives. This is not only the most pertinent cutscene in the plant section thus far, but is also the longest and heaviest on plot. It may feel like the game is front heavy on cutscenes and story, and that's because, well, it is. We've only made our way through 3 struts and already we've seen about half a dozen cutscenes. I believe this was a deliberate design and pacing decision by Kojima, as he wanted to really establish himself as like the Michael Bay of the medium. It's also made reviewing the embryonic stages of the plant section more challenging and lengthy, as I think it's important to set the stage to cover the game thus far and, more importantly, contextualize everything to come. Mercifully, however, this one encounter with Stillman sets up the remainder of the plant chapter's first act. Because of Stillman's gammy leg, he tasks both Raiden and Pliskin with defusing the bombs, with Raiden scouring Shell 1 and Snake searching in Shell 2. He gives them a bomb detector to locate them and a cooling spray to freeze them. So with all the tools they need, we finally get our first stretch of relatively uninterrupted gameplay. This bomb disposal subplot cleverly gives the player a legitimate reason to thoroughly explore all of the struts. As I mentioned, each of the struts are identical externally and all have the same beige hue. However, they all have different interior designs which increase in complexity, making going from strut to strut gradually more challenging. The first 3 struts contain the pump facility, generator and cafeteria, which are all single-leveled, easy to navigate and sparsely patrolled by enemy guards. The remaining 3 struts contain a settlement pool, a conveyor belt / helipad and a warehouse. These are multi-storied, more heavily manned, and more structurally complex struts that challenge the player's ability to stealthily move in different ways. The settlement pool has 2 tiers and very few places to hide, making Raiden extra visible and more vulnerable. The conveyor belt or factory area naturally creates super tight ventricles which are heavily manned, while the boxes moving throughout the conveyors mean that certain cover positions shift in real time. While the warehouse is just that, a 2-story strut with different rooms packed together with guards moving in and out. Raiden also doesn't have the access cards to enter all the rooms initially, limiting his potential hiding places. Having to locate the bombs also forces you to comb through the big shell and deal, directly or indirectly, with the enemies. The methods of doing so are similar to MGS1 in that you can choke them unconscious, beat them unconscious, this time with some fancy taekwondo, including a tornado kick, or simply kill them, along with tranking them as Snake did on the tanker. However, new to the series is holding enemies up. Sneak up behind them with a gun and you'll force them to freeze. You can then go to them face to face and hold them up for items. Moreover, each enemy has a dog tag which can only be acquired by holding them up. If they refuse to give you anything, the only way to retrieve them is to shoot a limb with a lethal weapon, which can only be done effectively using a silencer, which you have to acquire through exploration. Dog tag collection never occurred in any other Metal Gear game, which is a shame because it's one of my all-time favourite collectible side quests in gaming, and it's just one of many Easter eggs present in MGS2, but it's by far my favourite. The locations of the bombs can also be a little ingenious at times. Highlights include underneath a manhole cover at the sediment pool and encircled by a mountain of boxes in the warehouse, which can only be accessed by hanging over the ledge and dropping to the floor below. Hanging and shimmying along ledges and bridges being one of the new gameplay mechanics added to the game from MGS1. The bomb disposal section also features one of the most practical implementations of the game's higher difficulty. Play on harder extreme and there are actually more bombs to dispose of. For example, on easy there is just 1 bomb in the pump room, but on hard there is an additional one on the roof of that strut. This is also the moment where the plant mission really finds its pacing. As I said, the opening moments are very story and cutscene heavy, including little actual gameplay. However, this is necessary to lay the groundwork for what is one of the deepest, craziest and most convoluted stories in gaming history. And also, this is a Metal Gear game, so what do you expect? Conversely, the bomb disposal section evens out the story to gameplay ratio, skewing on the side of exploration over narrative. It also serves to highlight what a unique and fun environment the Big Shell is to explore. When you begin freezing the bombs, you'll get sporadic calls from Stillman asking about the locations. When you relay the information to Stillman, he seems perplexed, assessing that the locations would not be optimum to destroy the Big Shell. The game does a good job of building intrigue here, as you go from strut to strut, disabling bombs, all the while wondering what Fat Man's plan ultimately is. Growing suspicious, Stillman goes to Strut H to investigate. When both you and Snake disable the last of your bombs, it starts a countdown to trigger a larger bomb at the base of Strut A. Fat Man had used the other bombs as diversions to activate his new scentless bomb. Not only did this fool Stillman, but led him directly to another bomb which explodes almost immediately. It is also revealed during this time that Stillman never actually lost his leg in that church explosion, but faked a prosthetic to cope with the guilt over the civilians who died. This by itself isn't a bad subplot. My main issue here is that Stillman isn't an established enough character for it to be truly effective. He's literally only in this series for this small portion of this one game, and the only knowledge we have of the incident is revealed secondhand by Stillman himself in his inaugural and final cutscene. The game literally could have just not introduced the fake leg angle and it wouldn't have made any difference. They even could have kept the story about him failing to defuse the church bomb to make him a sympathetic character with PTSD. Instead, the fake leg angle just feels like Kojima trying to manufacture drama, so it feels forced rather than a part of the game's organic storytelling. With limited time, Raiden must rush to the dock of Strut A to freeze the real bomb. Upon doing so, the bomb disposing section of the game draws to a conclusion. The plant section of the game has a unique way of compartmentalizing its different sections. First, it was purely cinematical. Then it introduces a bomb disposing side mission which never returns. And now we're going to move into back-to-back boss battles. Personally, I don't mind this, and so far it doesn't really feel disjointed, running along at a satisfying pace. It just feels a little unconventional, especially when compared to the Tanker, which seemed to juggle its various plot points and gameplay mechanics simultaneously. Regardless, the game, both Tanker and Plant, will have been nothing but a blast, no pun intended, up until now. Directly after disposing of the bomb, we're immediately thrust into our first boss battle on the big show, and it's a weird one. Confronted by Fortune at the base of Strut A, this is a battle for survival rather than a duel. Unable to hit or wound her no matter how much you shoot her, all you can do is run between cover as barrels ignite and debris falls all around you, and Fortune tries to fry you with her railgun. Do this for long enough and you'll get a call from the Colonel saying Fat Man has planted a new bomb on Strut E and asked to face Raiden specifically. The game does a good job here of ramping up the tension and the sense of urgency. It also tries its best to bombard you with information and unanswered plot strands. After the quote-unquote fight, Vamp reappears to converse with his Fortune, or his queen as he calls her. He informs her that Fat Man has gone rogue and is planning to blow up the big shell, going against theirs and Commander Jackson's plans. Commander Jackson being the dead Marine commander from the Tanker incident, and it is discovered, father of Fortune. The death of whom has filled Fortune with so much grief that she wishes for death which cannot find her, leading her to even implore Raiden, and everyone else it seems, to kill her. Raiden tries to shoot Fortune, but the bullet deflects off her and hits Vamp, who collapses with a bullet hole in his head. Sneaking past the duo, Raiden heads up the elevator, when suddenly Vamp revives in Fortune's arms. Without much time to process what has happened, you must rush once again to beat the clock and dispose of the bomb on the roof of Strut E. After doing so, you'll hear the sound of rollerblades, followed by the introduction of Fat Man. Fat Man is, believe it or not, a rather rotund individual who moves around on roller skates. Holding a wine glass, he fills Raiden in on his plan to blow up the entire big show. As Vamp had alluded to, Fat Man's goal, which is to become the most famous bomber in history, is running in contradiction to the rest of Dead Cell. This creates a new unanswered narrative thread, with Fat Man himself quipping, quote, "You'll know soon enough at Raiden," and the player's confusion. All of this lends to the narrative technique Hideo Kojima introduced in the first game, which is to build up a web of unanswered questions, all leading to a big reveal at the end of the game. However, whereas Metal Gear Solid 1 resolved some plot points early on to help familiarise and contextualise the situation, Metal Gear Solid 2 leaves the player deliberately in the dark for a large majority of the game, which puts a huge amount of pressure on the story reveal at the end of the game. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's just focus on the boss itself. So far in MGS2, we've had 3 boss fights and all of them have been unconventional.
The one with Fortune essentially sees any offense nullified, and the Olga one, while a conventional shootout, sees her and Snake on two separate platforms and eliminates any use of lethal force. This boss has Fat Man skating around the helipad, planting timed bombs in random locations and shooting at Raiden. What makes this unique, aside from the obvious eccentricities of Fat Man as a character, is the dual task of freezing the bombs while also trying to kill Fat Man. It makes for a stressful yet reasonably enjoyable affair. However, if I'm being honest, it does highlight one of the game's biggest weaknesses. Foxhound, the collection of bosses in the first Metal Gear Solid, were one of the best parts of that game. Gameplay wise, they were varied and eclectic, but were so fundamentally sound and downright fun that many of them became all-time classics among gaming bosses. Crucially, their characters were just as strong. Charismatic, intimidating, and actually rather likeable. Their personalities only served to make these awesome encounters even more enjoyable. Their stories were also scripted and paced expertly, with just enough of their personalities and backstories being revealed. Many of them also battled Snake twice, which allowed Kojima to flesh out their stories even more, which only increased player investment in them. This not only gave the fights more significance, but made their conclusions more satisfying and, at times, even emotional. The problem with Metal Gear Solid 2 is that it falls short in these two areas, particularly the latter. Gameplay wise, most of the bosses are fine, they're just not excellent. Fat Man is a fun encounter, there's no doubt about it, but he simply cannot hold a candle to the likes of a Psycho Mantis or a Cyborg Ninja from MGS1. And Fat Man is one of the better bosses in the entire game. It also doesn't help that, as players, we're just not invested in Dead Cell as a group. There are many reasons for this. Firstly, they're just not as cool or likeable as Foxhound. They're eclectic, sure, but try as they might, a Fortune just doesn't have the depth of a Sniper Wolf, and a Vamp isn't as cool or iconic as a Cyborg Ninja. And the game doesn't do itself any favours by limiting the player's exposure to these characters. As I said, in MGS1, you often have multiple run-ins with these characters, fleshing out their personalities, motivations, and idiosyncrasies. Conversely, you only have one encounter with Fat Man, which ends with you killing him. Even with regards to the members of Dead Cell you come across on multiple occasions, such as Vamp, they never really get enough exposure to make you truly care about them one way or the other. And the bits you do get don't exactly elicit much emotional reaction from you for the most part. Again, and I've said this ad nauseum at this point, the game deliberately trickles its plot out gradually, and there's a logical reason for this. Even still, I feel like Kojima could have done a better job of endearing the characters to the player, and I believe it would have been entirely possible to flesh out Fat Man, Vamp, and Fortune's characters without revealing too much about the overall story. The only member of Dead Cell who doesn't suffer this abrupt character work is Solidus. His character's pacing within the story is actually pretty spot on. So with that said, there's no reason why the first time I see and hear Fat Man also happens to be the last. Especially not for a game that prides itself on its extensive, sophisticated storytelling. After the Fat Man fight, we are confronted by a cyborg ninja named Mr. X, Metal Gear Solid 2's answer to Grey Fox from Metal Gear Solid 1. Although completely friendly this time around, Mr. X uses a similar voice disguiser as Fox and copies large chunks of his dialogue also, creating more parallels between the two games. The appearance of the ninja also acts as the first major story break in the game. Mr. X tells Raiden that Richard Ames, a Secret Service agent, is one of the hostages being held in the core of Shell 1. Giving Raiden an access card and an enemy uniform, the kind of which is only worn in the Shell core, a convenient enough excuse to allow Raiden to blend in there but nowhere else in the game, that just about passes the smell test. He then tells Raiden that he must locate the enemy gun, an AK-47, along with the directional microphone, which he needs to hear Ames' pacemaker to identify him. Mr. X won't reveal why he is helping Raiden, but confirms that he is a messenger from the Lally Lule Lo, also known as the Patriots. He also tells Raiden that the Big Shell is actually a cover for a Metal Gear, and that Dead Cell have a nuclear weapon. After this encounter, we are still left with more questions than answers, but the level of intrigue is only increasing. The Shell 1 core section of the game is among the most fun and creative in the entire series.
After getting your hands on an AK-47, you enter the shell core in enemy garb, which changes the dynamic with enemy NPCs. You can run past the enemies and security cameras in plain sight, which makes disposing of enemies or just bypassing them altogether significantly easier. That being said, if you run directly into an enemy guard, your disguise will be ripped off and you will be exposed. After finding the directional microphone, dodging a packed office of guards and a noisy parrot, you have to get into the hostage room, which is protected by a biometric scanner. In order to access it, you need to drag an enemy guard in a chokehold to the scanner. Something which can take a while to figure out, akin to the CD case frequency debacle in MGS1. After making your way in and using the directional mic to locate Ames, another long narrative expedition takes place. Ames alludes to his involvement with the Patriots and explains to Raiden that the goal of Dead Cell and Solidus is actually detonation. But rather than a lethal atomic bomb, its function is the destruction of all the technology on Manhattan, the result of which they hope will result in the quote-unquote liberation of Manhattan, hence the moniker Sons of Liberty. Which makes sense when Solidus can be heard referencing Outer Heaven when speaking to Ocelot. Speaking of which, Ocelot, Olga and Solidus have a tense discussion about Fat Man, the ninja and Raiden, with Ocelot letting on that he knows less than he actually does, all of which can be overheard using the directional mic. When Ocelot appears to confront them both, Ames has a heart attack eerily similar to that of the DARPA chief and Kenneth Baker in MGS1. Just when it looks like Raiden is about to be massacred, the ninja appears yet again to save his life. Exiting the room, Raiden, now maskless, must escape the Shell 1 core, which is under high alert. This makes for one of the most tense moments in the entire game. Even though it is almost a certainty that you would have been caught at some point during the game and hunted down, the preceding moments add a level of intensity to the situation, as you are uncertain of the severity of the alarmed response on the shell. I can remember the first time I played this having an overwhelming desire just to flee the big shell. It never even occurred to me to even try to hide and wait it out. In hindsight, the armed response is no more severe than the regular alert phase in any other area of the game. But given the memory of recent events, the relative unfamiliarity of your new surroundings, and the fact that there aren't 5 more struts within close proximity to run off to, and coupled with the tight level design and brilliantly tense music, it feels more dangerous and urgent than it really is. This is a credit to the team at Konami, and shows their prowess when it comes to game design. For me, this is the unofficial conclusion of the first third of the Plant chapter, and the first half of the game overall. It also marks the end of a long string of cutscenes and extended story expedition, similar to the succession of boss battles that came before it, the bomb disposal that came before that, the setup before that, and the tanker prelude at the beginning. So let's take a moment to truly compliment the pacing of MGS2 at this juncture. For me, Metal Gear Solid 2 is the most well-paced out of all the games in the series. Even though it has a way of deliberately compartmentalizing its various facets in separate sections, a risky design strategy that could have backfired, it somehow manages to keep its pacing brilliantly consistent. I've spoken in other reviews about the importance of pacing in video games, and Metal Gear Solid 2 is a brilliant example of this. The way it cycles between extended moments of gameplay and narrative is exceptional. I also want to reiterate for the final time both the quality and overall importance of the tanker mission. As I said, without the tanker, the first third of the Plant chapter may have felt a little repetitive and dull. It sounds like an insult to say that its biggest strength is how it contrasts with the main game, but it's actually a huge compliment. Its game within a game feel, tight linear structure, nostalgic feel, and compelling gameplay make it perhaps, and without question in my opinion, the greatest opening chapter in video game history. I love that this little moment exists all by itself. I love that the studio put so much time into creating it, despite its brevity. I love the little Easter eggs and nuances that are unique to this chapter and this chapter alone, many of which I will highlight later. But most of all, I love how it perfectly assists with the pacing and narrative development of the game as a whole. As we move into the second portion of the game, we have to make our way across the bridge between Shells 1 and 2. However, the bridges aren't but Semtex. In order to disable them, you have to shoot a control box for each bomb. In order to effectively do this, you need to return to Strut F and locate a sniper rifle. I want to take a quick moment to acknowledge Strut F,
as it may be my favourite one in the whole game. It's a claustrophobic 2-storey space of locked doors, representing many of the best mechanics of the game. The tension of the close proximity to enemy guards, the dynamic level design, and the progression in the form of its gradually unlockable doors, among other qualities. Disabling the bombs on the bridge once again displays the ingenuity of Konami and Kojima. It's not just that the game has them planted on all ends of the bridge, hence the need for a sniper rifle. It's the unique and varied locations of the control boxes that makes it so much fun. There are roughly a dozen boxes that need to be shot, but among the most creative are strapped to an enemy cipher, behind a literal flock of seagulls, and obscured by a Sons of Liberty flag, which comes in and out of view depending on the trajectory of the wind. This can be time consuming for the first time, but it's just another one of those Metal Gear quasi-puzzles that's satisfying as hell upon solving. This brings us to our next boss fight, and this time it's against Solidus himself. I already mentioned how some of the other characters like Fatman and Stillman didn't feel fleshed out enough, but Solidus' introduction is really great. He insists that he is Solid Snake, a fact debunked by the man himself, who's standing at the passenger side of a helicopter during the fight, providing Raiden with ammo. The fact that Solidus recognises Raiden, but unsure where from, his name dropping of Big Boss and the Patriots, all builds intrigue and anticipation, doesn't feel rushed and, crucially, as you could surmise being that he is the main protagonist, will not be the last encounter between the two, giving Solidus' character room to evolve. The boss itself is a showdown between Raiden on the floor with support from Snake, and Solidus in the Harrier fighter jet with Vamp. Similarly to the Olga fight, this encounter mimics another boss from MGS1, namely the Hind D showdown with Liquid Snake. That being said, it feels distinctly MGS2 by employing the presentation and design elements that differentiate the two titles. The bridge location is both simultaneously more claustrophobic and dynamic than the rooftop of Shadow Moses, and the music is more modern and techno-based than the sweeping 90s movie score of Metal Gear Solid 1. All of this on a whole makes it more tense and more challenging than its predecessor. The fighter jet moves at a very fast pace, making it harder to hit with a Stinger missile, and it blitzes far more often than the Hind did. Even when it's stationary, its attack is devastating, raining down multiple missile strikes on Raiden. The bridge location offers very little cover, meaning Raiden has to keep moving. This makes defensive play much more challenging, leaving far less room for error. Overall, it's one of the better bosses in the game, perhaps even the best, and that's thanks both to the hectic gameplay and the cutscenes that precede it.
Even still, it somehow still manages to be a less engrossing affair than its MGS1 counterpart. For me, a large part of that has to do with the music. Now don't get me wrong, the musical score for MGS2 is absolutely fantastic, continuing the tradition of exceptional and criminally underrated sound design ever present in the series.
That being said, the Dead Cell boss music just doesn't really do it for me. While it attempts to create a sense of panic and urgency through its heavy use of drum and bass and frantic woodwind, it's more akin to something you'd hear in a nightclub in 1999 than an intense showdown in film or gaming. Conversely, the music in MGS1, while not as nuanced or perhaps not even as well performed, did an exceptional job of setting the tone and still ranks for me as one of the best original soundtracks in gaming. Again, the Harrier fight isn't bad, it's actually very good. But in a series famous for its bosses, it just doesn't hold up by comparison. The same of which, unfortunately, can be said for the rest of the bosses in the game. After the fight, Metal Gear Ray appears out of nowhere, rescuing the now one-eyed Solidus while Vamp runs away on water. This feels appropriate as you enter MGS2's second half, as the story only gets more complicated and bizarre from here. It's also at this time that Pliskin reveals himself to Raiden as the Solid Snake, along with introducing Otacon. They explain who they are and what philanthropy is to him. Meanwhile, the Colonel denies any relationship with Snake whatsoever, which casts some aspersions on the Colonel's character. This also signals the end of the clean, symmetrical level design that was the game's first half. The level design that follows is much more varied, but also more scattered and contrived. After the destruction of Strut L and the flooding of H Strut, our exploration of Shell 2 has essentially been reduced to the decimated remains of what was the Big Shell's second hexagon. Now, there is no way to know whether or not this was done purposely to save disk space and the plot was written around it, or whether it was the plan all along. Sure, it would have been cool to have had 6 new struts to explore, and while that certainly would have been preferable, having the terrain altered by the effects of the explosives adds a bit of flavour to the environment, while also fitting with the continuity of the story. Either way, we have to make our way to the Shell 2 core. This includes rappelling down some debris, tiptoeing along crap-covered pipes, avoiding patrolling enemies at open windows, and yes, even being peed on. When we make our way to the Shell 2 core, we're confronted with an electrified floor blocking our path to the President, requiring a Nikita missile to disable. This leads to a fun, almost minigame-esque moment when you have to launch a Nikita missile through a network of vents and destroy the electrical box in the room without actually killing the President. What follows is the first of a few new lengthy story expeditions. Now, while it's true that there have been lengthy cutscenes and extended moments of pure plot thus far, none of them have reached the complexity, ambition, and, frankly, bizarreness of what occurs in the game's final act. And it begins here. The game's first truly revelatory moment. Up until this point in the series, you may have heard mentions of the Patriots. However, little is known about them until your conversation with President Johnson. And while many of the key details about the Patriots, such as their identities, origins, and means of implementing their will, wouldn't be fully exposed until later games, their function and motivations are laid out here by the President. Essentially, the Patriots are a shadow organisation that run the United States of America behind the scenes, controlling everything from politics to the military to the economy. This means that matters such as acts of war and presidential elections are all a form of controlled presentation put on for the public, when in reality they are orchestrated by the Patriots behind the scenes. In essence, the Patriots are the Metal Gear universe's equivalent of the Illuminati, a group that some people believe exists in reality that control the world in a similar way. Naturally, that means that Johnson was hand-selected by the Patriots to be the next president, in exchange for his total loyalty and secrecy. However, Raiden finds out that the president is cooperating with the terrorists by inputting the code sequence for the nuke. He hoped that by doing this, he could essentially blackmail his way into becoming a member of the Patriots, thereby being able to wield more power as opposed to just being a figurehead. However, unlike Johnson, Solidus has every intention of taking on the Patriots and following through on his plan to liberate the United States from their control. We find out the catalyst for this when Johnson reveals his backstory. Solidus was actually his presidential predecessor, George Sears. We also find out that he was responsible for the Shadow Moses incident, using his ally Revolver Ocelot to provoke Liquid Snake to get the data from Metal Gear Rex and the Genome Army. However, after the whole thing went tits up, the world learned of the existence of the new Metal Gear, as well as the Genome Army, forcing Sears to resign. The Patriots also planned to assassinate him, but he went underground with Ocelot, taking control of Dead Cell, all of which led to him seizing control of Big Shell and the new Metal Gear. It's also here that the identity of the new Metal Gear is revealed, and its name is Arsenal Gear. As a player, we are led to believe that Metal Gear Ray is the new Metal Gear. However, the Ray unit we saw was one of dozens used to actually guard Arsenal, which is itself equipped with thousands of missiles and nuclear warheads. The Big Shell, officially an offshore cleanup facility, is in fact Arsenal Gear itself, camouflaged. The Patriots intend on using Arsenal as a kind of base of operations, using the weapons as a deterrent. The key to Arsenal Gear, however, is GW, a system they hope to use to control the information flow in what was then a new age of internet and digital information flow. Johnson wished to seize control of it to gain access into the Patriots' ranks. Solidus, however, wishes to use Arsenal to ignite an EMP blast over Manhattan, disabling the country's key economic hub, which he hopes will loosen the Patriots' grip over America. The President orders Raiden to stop this as he fears the vacuum left in its wake will essentially tear the Republic apart. He informs him that a programmer named Emma Emmerich, yes, Otacon's sister, is also in the Shell 2 core, and that she is the only one who can upload a virus into the GW system, hence corrupting it. He then orders Raiden to shoot him. He refuses, but it's okay because Ocelot appears and just does it for him. Now, The function of Arsenal, GW, and the desire for information control is far more complex than what I've outlined so far. So much in fact that much of the explanation for these things wasn't fully elaborated upon until Metal Gear Solid 4. But we'll elaborate on that as much as possible later in the video. Still, this cutscene is indicative of what makes the series so special, and what makes MGS2 arguably the best game in the series. Out of a game of super long cutscenes and complex narratives, this is the first truly climactic, revelatory, and insane moment in the entire game. The explanation of what the Patriots are alone is so crazy and hard to wrap your head around the first time you hear it, that it is something that could only occur in an MGS game. The first 3 games were story driven, sure, and the first solid game dipped more than a toe into complex and esoteric storytelling. But this was the first game in the series where Kojima threw caution to the wind and just committed to what would turn into the most complex story, chronology, and alternative timeline in gaming history. For those who don't appreciate this kind of storytelling, it's almost hellish to endure. For the rest of us, it's just amazing. Raiden then calls both Colonel and Snake. The Colonel and Rose seem almost apathetic to the whole situation, and basically just encourage Raiden to continue the mission. Snake and Otacon, on the other hand, are incredulous after learning of Johnson's assassination, and upon hearing that Raiden has found out about the Patriots, at least in part, decide to fill Raiden in on the backstory of the tanker mission. Essentially, Snake was lured out, most likely by the Patriots, to be on the ship when it was hijacked, photographing him and framing him as the terrorist behind the operation, even though it was Ocelot who conducted it. Otacon hypothesizes that the reason for this was because Snake survived the Shadow Moses incident and became a hero, neither of which was supposed to happen due to Foxdie and the government secrecy. They, the Patriots, wanted to destroy Snake's reputation to re-establish control over the narrative. This moment helps solidify, you see what I did there? A few things. First of all, it finishes tying in the tanker and plant chapters, re-establishing the tanker incident's importance in the story and reminding the players of just how much fun it was, while continuing to emphasize the dichotomy between both sections of the game. The second is further driving a wedge between Raiden's 2 support systems. As previously mentioned, Raiden is a naive and emotional character, who relies heavily on the support of both Roy Campbell and Rose, as well as Snake and Otacon. However, as the game goes on, Raiden becomes more suspicious of the former and more reliant on the latter. This would carry much more significance later on, and we'll talk about that as well as Raiden's character, perhaps the most divisive in the series, later on. But for now, we've got some swimming to do. The majority of the basement of Shell 2 core has been flooded due to Fat Man shenanigans, so in order to reach Emma, we are required to do a little swimming. These areas of the game aren't terrible, but they are mediocre and not really that enjoyable. The problem is that the swimming physics just don't look or feel natural. It feels stiff as hell and there is no real lateral movement, which may be due to the limitations of the era's hardware, or just the lack of time put into developing the swimming mechanics, due to the brevity of it in the game as a whole. Aside from the limited breathing time, the game also tries to ramp up the difficulty by putting naval mines in your pathway. This doesn't make sense from a storyline perspective, as the core had just recently been flooded and was never intended to be submerged in water at all. It also highlights the limitations of the swimming mechanics, because your inability to move fluidly or control your speed in any meaningful way makes it difficult to avoid swimming directly into these things. And in this instance, dying feels more like a design flaw rather than your own lack of skill, which is never a good thing in a video game. The fact that you have to swim through this area twice also means that the unpleasant experience is basically doubled. Again, this is far from a deal breaker, and I appreciate that Kojima tried to vary up the gameplay by essentially introducing a completely fresh set of mechanics, but I feel like it doesn't really add anything to the game and is easily MGS2's most unenjoyable moment. It does, however, lead us to our next boss fight, a showdown with Vamp, who is sitting in the middle of a purified water pool in a lotus pose. When Raiden acknowledges that he is still alive, complete with Raiden's gunshot wound still visible in his forehead, Vamp quips that, unfortunately, hell had no vacancies. Again, I can see that this kind of dialogue was used to help make Vamp seem like a witty badass, but for some reason, he never struck me as either. I just never really got or enjoyed his character that much. His description of Dead Cell's motivations, however, are much more grounded in reality. He wants to use Arsenal's hydrogen bomb to wipe out the Patriots and a large chunk of the world. He doesn't want to do this purely to liberate the country from the Patriots' control, however. His main motive is revenge. The Patriots had orchestrated the mass slaughter of civilians and blamed it on Dead Cell, who were once formerly a faction of the Navy SEALs under George Sears. In fact, what the Patriots did to Vamp and his unit is very similar to what they did to Snake. It also bears a resemblance to some of the most controversial conspiracy theories, such as the one surrounding Operation Northwoods and the Gulf of Tonkin, and one huge one in particular, which occurred not too long before the release of MGS2. But for the sake of preventing this video from being taken down, I'm not going to elaborate any further. Much like the Olga and Solidus fights, the Vamp encounter is a quasi-mimic of a Shadow Moses showdown that doesn't quite match up to the original. In this fight, Vamp is playing the role of Cyborg Ninja, with both men having superhuman reflexes with the ability to dodge gunfire. However, whereas the fight with Fox eventually morphs into a hand-to-hand duel, you cannot attack Vamp with your hands or feet. Also, while the Grey Fox encounter takes place in a relatively large office space, the Vamp one, as with much of the rest of the game, takes place in a much more cramped environment. Smack bang in the middle of a tiny room is a pool of purified water which contains no buoyancy, meaning if you fall in you will not resurface. Therefore, your movements are essentially limited to the square runway that encircles the pool. For most of the fight, Vamp cycles between swimming underwater, which I guess he can do since he's a kind of undead superhuman vampire, and tightrope walking the balcony above the runway. His means of attack are throwing knives, including a special shiny one that freezes Raiden in place, making him essentially defenseless. If you attack Vamp head on while he's looking at you, he'll simply dodge your attacks, so you have to fire upon him when his back is turned, or when he's otherwise distracted. You can also shoot his knives out of the air in first person, which is a nice touch. Vamp can also be hurt by firing certain launchers into the water while he's swimming. The game does a nice job of ramping up the difficulty towards the end of the fight, with Vamp chasing after Raiden on the walkway to slash him. This poses one of the most genuinely challenging problems for the player in the game, as dodging these slicing attacks is actually quite tricky, but unlike the swimming section earlier, it doesn't feel like a design flaw. Rather, it feels like a very deliberate difficulty spike. It also re-emphasises MGS2's feeling of claustrophobia, as it incrementally reduces Raiden's movement and evasive options. Even though this can't hold a candle to the Grey Fox fight, and I personally think that there are better bosses in the game, this is one of the most satisfying to complete because it feels more like you survived Vamp than you beat him in many respects. The main issue with the fight is unfamiliarity. Even though you saw Vamp on multiple occasions, unlike Fat Man, it still feels similar to that fight in that it feels like both an introduction and a climax at the same time, which is a pacing issue most of the bosses in the game had, and one that none of the ones in Metal Gear Solid 1 ever suffered from. To be fair, Vamp does pop back up later in the game, but it's so brief and just serves as a way to conclude a different storyline. With that said, now with Vamp disposed of, at least for now, it's time to chat with EE.
Anyway, after a quick chat convincing Emma to accompany you on the swimming backtracking section despite her fear of water, which is made all the more difficult and frustrating due to Emma's awful lung capacity and lower health bar, you make your way back to the purification room, where Emma continues elaborating on her relationship with Hal Emmerich. Turns out they were step-siblings who were at one point inseparable. However, when they connect on codec, Emma accuses Otacon of abandoning her and her family, something Otacon denies. Otacon also gives her a bollocking for getting involved in the Arsenal Gear project, due to their family's history of developing weapons of mass destruction. As of now, this brief family history, as well as some not so subtle hints of step-sibling bedroom shenanigans, is all we have to go on, before we're treated to EE's most significant contribution to the game. In another one of those signature cutscenes, Emma reveals that she not only wrote the Arsenal Gear virus the President wanted her to install, but that she actually created GW itself. What's more, she gives an even more detailed explanation of what GW is and how the Patriots intend on using it. To put it simply, GW is designed as a filtration system for all digital information, which today would be called online information. The Patriots want to censor and delete information which does not align with their narrative or which may expose their existence. In the pre-internet age, information flow was limited to word of mouth, writing, and, as of the 20th century, video and audio recording. All of these information sources are, to some extent, impermanent. However, if you post something on the internet, it can potentially exist on there indefinitely, accessible by almost anybody. For a shadow organisation pulling the strings from behind the scenes, who seek to control the world while concealing their identity, they would naturally wish to control this new, infinitely more voluminous, powerful, and potentially harmful source of information flow. At the beginning of this video, a long time ago, Christ, this video was getting long, I talked about how ahead of its time Metal Gear Solid 2 was, and the GW plot strand is the main reason for me making that statement. To put this into context, you have to remember that this game was released in 2001, with the story and development beginning back in 1999. Now, the internet absolutely existed during this time. However, this was years before its proliferation as an essential part of everyday life. This game predates 5G, 4G, 3G, and smartphones by almost a decade. It predates the rise of social media. It predates broadband and the era where every home had an internet connection. It even predated the first serious use of internet monitoring and censorship, which became rampant with the ironically named Patriot Act, which was implemented post 9/11. 5 to 10 years ago, Metal Gear Solid 2 would have been considered ahead of its time based purely on the gargantuan rise of the internet as a near essential part of everyday life, and for becoming by far the largest source of information, both in terms of variety and pure volume, in history. However, as of the recording of this video in March 2022, it's even more significant now than ever.
I've said this once and I'll say it again. This is not a political channel. I try my best to veil my own political beliefs as much as possible, simply because I don't think it's pertinent to the topics I cover, and also because I want you to be entertained by my content without having to worry about being bombarded by self-indulgent virtue signalling. That being said, the subject of censorship, be it in the media, in entertainment, in politics, has never been more relevant. Cancel culture and the subject of free speech continues to be hotly contested. People are being deplatformed, lambasted, and vilified in the current day for landing on the wrong side of the political spectrum, with droves of people attempting to fight back against it, while many others celebrate it as a form of justifiable social justice. The internet plays a huge role in this on both sides. On the one hand, it has given everyone a platform on which to speak their mind. On the other hand, many popular sites, search engines, and social media platforms have implemented policies which prohibit certain people with certain beliefs from expressing their opinions. Accusations on both sides, ranging from disinformation to doxing to fake news, dominate the discourse of our world today. And no matter what side you land on, there is no doubt that media censorship, not too dissimilar from the filtering system described by EE, is being used to shape the narrative and, potentially, alter history. Look, back in 2001, people understood the importance and the potential of the internet. Even though I was quite young at the time and all we had was a dial-up connection, if we even had that back then, I still remember grasping the significance of this thing, whatever it was. Even with that said, very few people, if any, could have predicted what it would go on to become, the primary source of news and information, entertainment, and, somewhat regrettably, communication in general. So whether Kojima had incredible foresight, or whether the current usage of the internet just so happens to mirror the GW story arc with almost unnerving accuracy, it's moments like this that have earned him the reputation as perhaps the greatest storyteller in video game history, and in my opinion, deservedly so. The second part of the water backtracking section is equally as dull and frustrating as the first. However, the second portion of the escort mission as a whole is surprisingly fun. All you have to do is make your way from the core of Shell 2 to the connecting bridge, and then to the base of Strut L from there. The main issue with the escort missions in video games is how they can upset the rhythm of the gameplay and how burdensome the escortee can be to the player. Metal Gear Solid 2 somehow offsets this by deliberately ramping up the difficulty level during this section. As you literally hold Emma's hand through these sections, the game not so subtly tosses extra enemy soldiers and ciphers at you, sometimes literally having guards appear out of nowhere just as you turn a corner. Although this may sound like lazy and blatantly obvious game design, it actually makes it fun because it makes Emma herself feel like a part of the challenge, rather than something hindering the flow of the game's natural pacing. It's like Kojima is throwing more obstacles at you with a wink and a nod, and it makes for some fun and tense gameplay, and offers up an alternative mechanical experience which is certainly much more enjoyable than any of the swimming expeditions. When you make your way to the base of Strut L, we're greeted with our second and final sniping section of the game. And much like the first, it's a really entertaining sequence that breaks up the stealth nicely. Basically, you have to make your way from the base of Strut L to the base of Strut E, so that Emma can then upload the GW virus in Shell 1's core. The only issue is that there are precarious wooden pallets that separate the struts from one another, meaning both Raiden and Emma cannot walk on them at the same time. It may be a pretty obvious setup, but it's a serviceable one, and means that Raiden has to cover Emma while she makes her way from one strut to the next. This necessitates Raiden to whip out his sniper rifle and eliminate, or stun should you have the Tranquilizer sniper rifle, one of the game's cooler weapons, all enemy threats, which essentially amounts to airborne ciphers and patrolling guards, most of which are located on the upper sections of the struts. This means that most all enemy attacks are coming from above, putting the player at a disadvantage. What's more, Raiden's view is often obscured by the environment. The struts are 360-degree structures, meaning that enemies will suddenly appear and disappear, and even Emma herself will disappear behind the struts for moments at a time. Again, much like with the earlier escort section, this doesn't feel like the game picking on you, but rather challenging you in a new way. The need for diazepam to steady your aim also returns from MGS1, and that too just feels like an additional but fair challenge, as you juggle firing with steadying your aim by popping in and out of the weapon and item menus. Solid Snake will also chime in to offer sniper support should you need it, which feels a little unnecessary, but you can always just choose to ignore his assistance. So again, this entire section plays out really well, right up until its abrupt conclusion. Midway through crossing the struts, Vamp suddenly emerges from the bottom of the Atlantic and takes EE hostage, holding a knife to her throat. This sets up a mini-boss where Raiden has to snipe at Vamp to free Emma. Now, to be frank, I don't actually mind the fact that Vamp appears from the bottom of the ocean and grabs a hold of Emma. It fits with his frankly ridiculous character. What does bother me is the execution of the encounter. In order to beat Vamp again, you have to hit him roughly half a dozen times with the sniper rifle. What infuriates me is that in order to facilitate this, Vamp will jerk EE from side to side in order to completely expose his body, allowing Raiden to get a clear shot at him. What makes this even more baffling is that he just ends up stabbing her anyway, meaning it wasn't even a hostage situation to begin with. What would have made this more exciting, more realistic, and less ridiculous would have been if you had a small window of time, say 3 to 5 seconds, to land a headshot on Vamp. This would have made everything, from Vamp's behaviour to the inevitable stabbing of Emma, more logical. Anyway, making your way back to Shell 1, under a countdown timer which is so lengthy it may as well not be there, Emma has just enough time to upload the virus before she succumbs to the old internal bleeding. The virus's upload gets cut short. However, given the fact that Emma's about to go to that big programming room in the sky, they decide to let her die in peace, while Snake informs Raiden that the only recourse is to take Solidus out. Before dying, EE confesses to Otacon that she only got involved with Arsenal gear so she could feel closer to him, and that she always wanted Otacon to see her as a woman, confirming her kinky step-sibling attraction. After perspiring, Otacon confesses that he was having sex with Emma's mother, and that his father took his own life as a result. Otacon then has a monologue where he talks about their lifelong desire to be loved, and how you can't just wait for love, that you have to work on finding love and finding a family. Themes which appeared in the first game, and that would have even further significance at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2. Metal Gear Solid 2 is, for the most part, a storytelling powerhouse. A tense, complex and thorough narrative that is one of the best in the history of the medium, and one that was, again, decades ahead of its time. However, it often fails to flesh out some of its characters. Dead Cell were a prime example of this, and Emma Emmerich is yet another. The scene between her and Otacon, as well as Otacon's monologue towards the end, are a little hacky but are actually quite emotional, especially with the excellent music playing in the background, which mercifully drowns out the terrible crying of otherwise great voice actor Christopher Randolph. Had Emma's character been introduced on screen at the beginning of the Plant chapter, which could have feasibly happened and would have made sense considering her relationship with Otacon and the fact that she is actually an extremely important character, given that she created GW, I feel her death would not just have been one of the more impactful moments in the game, but maybe even the entire series. However, because she was killed almost as soon as she was introduced, she's actually become relegated to quite a forgettable footnote in the series, which is unfortunate and, frankly, a total waste. Fortunately, the game's two biggest flaws, namely secondary character development and subpar boss fights, are a non-issue from here on out. Coincidentally, this is also the moment where Metal Gear Solid 2 goes from being weird to really goddamn bizarre. With Otacon leaving to fly the hostages off the big shell, Snake summons the ninja, revealing herself as Olga Gerlukovich, who holds up Raiden with the high-frequency blade, a both lethal and non-lethal sword. As she strikes Raiden with it, it appears as though he's been double-crossed by Snake, who reminds Raiden that he was, quote, never on his side. With Raiden now cold, it sets up the game's final act, and it does so under very familiar circumstances. Raiden awakes in a room in front of Ocelot and Solidus while strapped to a panel which is identical to the one Snake was tied to in MGS1. Ocelot even comments on this, saying it makes him feel nostalgic, and quipping that they are in, quote, the memory of Shadow Moses, a statement which would carry much more weight a little later. After a brief bit of shock therapy, Solidus reveals that he actually raised Raiden, or Jack, as a child soldier during a civil war. So ferocious was he in combat that he earned the nicknames Jack the Ripper and White Devil. After this revelation, Olga, who suddenly appears and is now alone with Raiden after the other two exit, reveals that she was sent by the Patriots to give support to Raiden on this mission. Her motivation for complying is that they kidnapped her child after birth and say that they will kill her if Raiden fails his mission. She also mentions something called the S3 plan, but we'll talk about that later. This is followed by a codec conversation between Raiden and Rose where, upon remembering, he fills her in on some of the grimmer details of the traumas he suffered as a child soldier, including being given a body count he had to achieve or suffer death himself, watching action movies for image training, and eating food laced with gunpowder. I love this moment for a variety of reasons. Chief among them is how it redeems Raiden's character. Throughout the Plant chapter, Raiden draws a number of unfavourable dissimilarities to Solid Snake. He's naive, inexperienced, surprisingly unassertive, not charming at all, a whiner, and just generally uncool. Also, since we live in a time when both Metal Gear Solid 4 and Metal Gear Rising have been released, we sometimes forget how reviled Raiden was in the wake of Metal Gear Solid 2. Fans were expecting, and were led to believe, that they would be playing as Snake, an established and, more importantly, much beloved character, so parallels between the two were always going to be drawn. Kojima deliberately subverted fan expectations by secretly changing protagonists, which would tie into an overarching story theme revealed at the end of the game. And while in hindsight we can view this as an extremely clever tactic and one hell of a trolling moment, at the time most fans were unhappy with the switcheroo, and therefore Raiden by extension. So much so in fact that the game suffered from mass fan backlash, almost exclusively due to the presence of Raiden as the main playable character. This backstory, however, at least for me, more than contextualizes Raiden as a character, it humanizes him. Finding out that Raiden was a ruthless child soldier who suppressed his memories of war should make you look at him differently. It's also kind of a subversion within a subversion. In other words, the first one was denying the player Snake as a playable character for the majority of the game. The second was taking Raiden as a protagonist who was designed to antagonize rather than endear, then suddenly alter his presentation and thusly our own perception of him. Many overlooked this at the time, as his presence alone was enough to override any story arc which may or may not have made him a more sympathetic character. But for me, this moment almost completely redeems him. His redemption is also another example of Kojima toying with our emotions in the best way possible. What's even more amazing is that the biggest twists, yes plural, were still to come. The conclusion of this portion of the game, which sees Olga releasing you, signifies what is for me the final chapter of the game, and boy is it equally weird and plot heavy. You start off completely naked, yes, completely naked, and have to locate Snake to get your gear back. This nudie section not only epitomizes Kojima's penchant for sophomoric humour, but naturally impacts the gameplay. First of all, Raiden has no weaponry whatsoever, meaning if he is discovered he's pretty much screwed, given the limited hiding places and whiteness of his bottom. Referred to as the colon of arsenal gear, again keeping with the theme of toilet humour here.
This sees the game's third and final architectural shift. First there was the tanker, then there was the plant, and now there's the colon and all that comes with it. Comprising of, for the most part, a 2-story area with only boxes and pillars for cover. It makes espionage more difficult, even if the player actually had weapons. What's more, the enemies in the colon, referred to as Tengu soldiers, are extremely acrobatic and are armed with assault rifles, heavy body armor, and swords, making them more formidable and intimidating. You also have Rose and the Colonel to deal with here. And what I mean by have to deal with is that the two of them appear to have lost their ever-loving minds. We discovered this through a series of, to put it lightly, bizarre conversations. These range from somewhat unnerving to absolutely hilarious. Here are some examples.
I hear it's amazing when the famous purple stuffed worm in Flapjaw Space with the tuning fork does a raw blink on Harry Carey Rock. I need scissors. 61. Actually, I'm in really bad shape financially. I pay money to my ex-wife as part of our divorce settlement, among other bills. I just had no choice but to make you pay for lunch the other day. I'm really sorry.
However, the final codec call ends with a conversation between Rose and Jack where Rose reveals to him that she's actually a Patriot spy. She was sent by them to monitor his every move and thought, reporting every minute detail to the organization. She also says that her appearance, such as her hair and eye colour, were altered to suit his tastes. After dropping what could realistically be called a minor bombshell and a potential relationship ender, her transmission cuts out, but not before we hear Rose, somewhat muffled by static, tell Raiden that she's also pregnant. After hopefully sneaking your way past the Tengu soldiers, you meet up with Snake, who returns your gear to you with an extra gift, the katana sword Olga used to knock you out. After a quick tutorial, you come to grips with your new weapon, which is introduced almost at the game's conclusion. However, unlike the swimming section, its inclusion feels natural, timely, and most importantly of all, actually highly enjoyable. It's a surprisingly fluid weapon which is controlled with the right analog stick, responding to the movements ranging from lateral sweeps to stabs to 360 sweeps. Its fluidity feels more like something from a 7th generation game rather than a 6th, where dynamic motion was a rarity. Snake then engages in a slight monologue, which I will reference later as it ties into one of the most important themes in MGS2, which, as I've already said multiple times, is revealed at the end of the game. The next section is by far the most action heavy in the entire game. Making your way through Arsenal, Snake and Raiden are confronted with an absolute buttload of Tengu soldiers across 2 rooms. You can eliminate them using conventional weapons, or, preferably, your new katana. Some of the soldiers also have swords, which they can use to deflect bullets, which Raiden can too, making the weapon even more badass. The first room is a generic 2-story hallway, while the second is a circular structure which is reminiscent of a virtual reality stage. One of the coolest things about this section is how Snake and Raiden fight together, with Snake playing the mentor role, providing ammo and counselling him. After eliminating all of the soldiers, Snake is confronted by Fortune, who blames Snake for killing her father, as she believes he was responsible for sinking the tanker, a la the Patriots, and Raiden is left to confront Solidus once again. Halfway through this section, you get a call from Otacon, who tells Raiden that the Colonel he's been talking to all along is an artificial intelligence created by GW, and that his own mind and expectations helped create him. The virus which has been injected into GW is the reason for his and Rose's erratic behaviour. Looking back, it seems so obvious that the Colonel was an AI, given his robotic cadence and unusual lexicon. However, the game did a great job of hiding this in plain sight, and it only becomes apparent in hindsight that something was off. Both Kojima's script and Paul Eiding, the voice actor of Colonel Campbell, deserve praise for pulling this off. This begins our expedition into one of the most complex themes in the entire game, solipsism. Solipsism, in a nutshell, is the idea that we cannot be sure of the existence of anything outside of our own mind. There are subtle indications of this idea sprinkled throughout the plant chapter, from the opening section where Raiden was given the codename Snake, to the fact that Raiden believes he had no real combat experience outside of VR, to the supernatural abilities of the Dead Cell unit, to the initial false betrayal of Snake, to the unsuppressing of Raiden's real-life military background, to Rose's confession of Patriot's allegiance, and now the revelation that Raiden had been talking to 2 AIs the whole time. This in turn makes Raiden question the existence of Rose, the Colonel, and by proxy, everything else around him. However, what comes next sees us diving down the Metal Gear rabbit hole even further. After ascending a ladder, you come to what appears to be a complete virtual reality area atop Shell 2, which is essentially a transparent blue and black floor surrounded by the all-black horizon of the ocean and the night sky. It's here that you are confronted by Solidus and an army of Metal Gear Rays. This is the penultimate boss battle and is arguably, alongside the final boss, one of the best fights in the game, meaning that MGS2 really saved the best for last here. The fight is pretty straightforward. You have to fight up to 3 Ray units at one time with your Stinger missile, attacking key points such as the knees and open mouth. What makes this battle so challenging and entertaining is the sheer bombardment of attacks coming at you. It's not just the fact that Metal Gear can launch missiles at you, shred you with a railgun, or zap you with a laser. It's the fact that 3 of these units can attack you with any 3 of these combinations in quick succession. However, the game does a great job of balancing this out. Each of the 3 attacks are performed exclusively from 3 different vantages, i.e., a Ray unit will only launch missiles from the opposite end of the platform to Raiden, while the laser attack can only be performed at close quarters. Each of these attacks also has distinct tells, such as the sound of a missile strike or the Ray units cocking their arm out to spray you with a railgun. This means that even though you're being overwhelmed with offense, you sort of find yourself slotting into a rhythm, picking off distant fresher targets while quickly preempting ones that are closing in, cyclically eliminating one Ray to be replaced by another of course, while gobbling rations as needed. This makes the whole fight feel overwhelming but fair, which is what the game is going for and what every boss should strive to achieve really. Again, this doesn't touch the best encounters of the 2 MGS games it's sandwiched between, including the Rex fight from MGS1, but it's pretty damn good all the same. But before this fight actually takes place, Solidus tells you what S3, the thing that Olga had alluded to earlier, actually is. S3 stands for Solid Snake Simulation. According to Solidus, the S3 plan was a Patriot's creation to mould any soldier in the image of Solid Snake, and that it was included in the VR training that Raiden had gone through prior to the Big Shell incident. He also asserts that they created this as a means to assassinate him being Solidus. After the fight, which ends when Raiden finds himself too exhausted to continue fighting, it looks like Raiden is about to be crushed by a Ray unit before Olga comes in and saves him, just like Fox did for Snake in MGS1. She reminds Raiden that he must survive in order for Olga's child to live. Solidus admonishes her for selling out her own men, before snapping her neck with his suit's tentacles. After that, the Ray units begin malfunctioning thanks to GW's virus, while Fortune arrives with Snake in handcuffs. Kinky. Solidus reveals that he knew Fortune was going to hijack Arsenal, and that he wasn't even going to stop her, as obtaining Arsenal was never his objective. Rather, his goal was to get a list of the names of the Patriots, which he theorized should be contained in the information they're attempting to censor. Before Fortune can saunter off, however, Ocelot lets out a laugh and reveals that the entire Big Shell incident, from the kidnapping of the president to the reformation of Dead Cell to even the sinking of the tanker 2 years ago, was the S3 training kernel in and of itself, and was in fact a recreation of Shadow Moses, in which Raiden is now playing the role of Solid Snake. The appearance of the ninja who aids Raiden saw Olga playing the part of Grey Fox. The Dead Cell unit were the surrogates for Foxhound unit, and subpar ones at that. Okay, that's my last dig, I swear. The deaths of Ames and the President were similar to that of the DARPA chief and Arms Tech President also. Other minor details, such as the initial encounter with Vamp in the bloody hallway, paralleling the beginning of the ninja fight in the first game, and the Harrier replacing the Hind D, are further examples of the similarities to Shadow Moses. He also shoots Fortune with his revolver, revealing that her inability to be wounded or killed was due solely to the Patriot's technology. He then hops into a Metal Gear Ray and unloads Ray's entire payload on a Defiant Fortune. All the missiles miss her, in spite of the fact that she can now be hit by weaponry. It doesn't make any sense, but it does make for a nice cutscene and a moment of redemption for Fortune, so I can forgive it. But Kojima would jump the shark in only a few moments anyway. This is what I love about Kojima and Metal Gear the most. This kind of foresight, the ability to weave a complex tale with a huge payoff which, at the time, goes completely over your head, but in hindsight seems so obvious. I love how they were able to copy so many elements from the previous game, ironically in a similar way that Metal Gear Solid 1 borrowed heavily from Metal Gear 2, without making it seem at all rehashed. It's fresh enough to feel like its own game, while familiar enough to give credibility to the story. This is a huge part of why MGS2 is my favourite game in the series. Then, as if it was possible at this point, Kojima went too far. Ocelot starts having arm spasms when, just as at the conclusion of the tanker mission, the voice of Liquid Snake emerges. He, being Liquid, reveals that he was living inside of Ocelot's arm the entire time through an arm transplant, which turns out to be Liquid's arm. He goes on to reveal that he leaked the information about the tanker to Snake to lure him out, presumably to his death. He then says he chose Ocelot as his host in order to learn the identity of the Patriots. He then jumps off the big shell into the ocean, with Snake diving after him. What annoys me about this isn't how nonsensical it is, and obviously it is complete bollocks. Bollocks they'd attempt to justify in Metal Gear Solid 4, but that's for another, hopefully shorter video. It's just how unnecessary it is. Liquid's inclusion here brings no additional value to the story. The story of MGS2 is about the Patriots, information control, identity, family, passing on one's genes, don't worry we'll get there, Snake's maturation, and Raiden's development. There was no need to horseshoe Liquid in here. So not only does it add nothing to the story, it actually detracts from it by dragging it from the bizarre but compelling into total absurdity. Speaking of the absurd, not too long after Snake's Michael Phelps-esque dive into the ocean, Arsenal gear becomes mobile and begins surging towards Manhattan from the ocean. Maybe the GW virus caused this sudden mobility, but this freak occurrence is never actually explained. Then, in even more comical fashion, it rips through a decent portion of Manhattan before crashing to a halt at Federal Hall. We don't actually see Arsenal tearing through buildings in Manhattan, however. This was initially the plan, but since the game was slated for release only a month after the attacks of September 11th, these scenes, along with some others, were edited out of the final release. Instead, the screen flashes to white just before Arsenal makes contact with the island, and fades back in with Solidus and Raiden being flung onto the roof of the Federal Hall, which sets up the final showdown. Before we get to their fight, however, I wanted to apologise for the length of this video. Metal Gear Solid 2 is one of my favourite games of all time. More than this, however, it has the most challenging story out of any game I've ever played. Not necessarily in terms of length or breadth, but thematically and in terms of complexity. There is so much to cover here that I ultimately felt that I had no choice but to go through the game moment by moment with spoilers abound, adding in analysis, praise and criticism as I went. I feel like a game and story of this calibre not only needed it, but frankly deserved it. The next video I do will not be this long or as intense, and will definitely be under an hour. Plus my next retrospective is on a much requested game, so stay tuned for that. Now, before we head into the home stretch of Metal Gear Solid 2 and this video review, I want to quickly list out some of the many Easter eggs littered throughout MGS2.
Completing pull-ups with either Snake or Raiden will increase their grip strength. If Snake finds potassium on the tanker, he can call Otacon, who will tell him it can cure seasickness. If Snake takes it and calls Otacon back, he'll tell him that it cured his seasickness, only for Otacon to tease him about it just being a placebo. Snake can even allude to this in the big shell in conversation with Raiden. If Snake knocks out the soldier in the crew's quarters with the flies around him, body checks him and picks up his rotten ration, those same flies will follow him around, potentially giving away his position. When filling out your information at the first node, if you select your birth date as being the same as the day of the console's internal clock, a happy birthday message will appear. The camera can secretly be controlled and zoomed during cutscenes. Placing an enemy soldier's body within the elevator of either the Shell 1 or the Shell 2 core, as well as the freight elevator in Strut A, will cause it to become inoperable. Snake can operate the projector in the second hold. The result of this can range from pictures of women appearing on the projector to a foreshadowing moment of Gorlukovich's men heading to the hold to hijack Ray. If Raiden points the directional mic at some of the female hostages, he will say their bust, hip and waist measurements out loud. If Raiden shoots seagulls from the sky, Rose and the Colonel will call him to chastise him, with Rose even refusing to save the game until Raiden apologises. Similarly, if Snake shoots Olga's body after tranquilizing her, Otacon will call Snake up to give him a similar bollocking. You can attack Snake multiple times as Raiden, including when you first meet him in Strut B, during the Harrier fight, and in Arsenal Colon when Snake gives you the HF blade. You can also knock Snake out for his dog tags here. However, Snake will always retaliate with force. During the Tanker chapter, if the player saves the game 13 times, Mei Ling will call you to correct a proverb that Otacon can't seem to interpret. She will also get angry at him for not using the cheat sheet that she provided him. When uploading photos to Otacon, several non-Metal Gear related ones will elicit different reactions from him, including photos of seductive women on posters making him blush, photos of bare male chests making him question Snake's sexuality, and a photo of a Marine in his underwear making him laugh. Similarly, Raiden can make multiple extracurricular uses of the directional mic, like using it to eavesdrop on series regular Johnny Twice, pointing it at one of the older female hostages to make her urinate and increase her heart rate, and for a variety of fun moments during Emma's walk along the oil fence. Honestly guys, these are just a very small handful of examples of all the Easter eggs in Metal Gear Solid 2.
Atop Federal Hall, Solidus starts having a laughing fit, but is at least kind enough to explain to us the reason for it. He tells Raiden that George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States 200 years ago today. This ties in with Solidus' fight against the Patriots, which is his desire to prevent them from censoring the flow of digital information, while pulling back the curtain, exposing their stranglehold over the nation, thus returning free will to its people and liberating them from the Patriots' control. Again, hence, Sons of Liberty. There are two problems with this though. Number one, I truly feel like they could have driven this point home without just demolishing half of Manhattan in such a preposterous way. I get the visual symbolism, and I get the feeling that Kojima just couldn't help himself. But in truth, it just feels like an evolving, continuing escalation of the absurd that really challenges my suspended disbelief. Like, if Solidus had given the same speech within the confines of Arsenal Gear, or if they had somehow made their way to Manhattan without going all Independence Day on its ass, the symbolism would have been just as effective. The second issue I have is much more straightforward, but far less forgivable. It isn't the 200th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration. Not even close. Raiden's mission takes place on April 29th, 2009, ending the following morning on April 30th. Washington was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, 220 years before the Big Shell incident. Given the significance of Kojima clearly attaches to this anniversary, it's hard to know if this was just an incredible oversight, or if he threw it in there anyway, hoping nobody would notice. And frankly, I don't know which is worse. Anyway, no need to dwell on it, but it still bugs the crap out of me. After reiterating his disdain of the Patriots and their stranglehold on the country, Solidus goes on to talk about one of the biggest overarching themes in the entire series: the passing on of one's genes. Solidus' other motivation for wanting to destroy the Patriots is because by doing so, he believes he will leave a significant enough mark on history, a history which cannot be censored. He wants to do this because, as a son of Big Boss and one of the Les Enfants Terribles project, which was designed to create clones of Big Boss using his DNA, he was unable to reproduce. He could just adopt, I guess. I mean, he did kill Raiden's parents and kind of raise him as his own in his child army. Oh yeah, Solidus killed Raiden's parents, just an FYI. But you know, semantics. Being a part of Les Enfants Terribles is also a huge factor in why Solid and Liquid fight, but that's a subject for another video. Before we have our final showdown with Solidus though, we do get an unexpected codec call from the GW versions of Colonel and Rose, which leads to what is undoubtedly the most batshit moment in Metal Gear history, which is a gargantuan statement in and of itself. The Colonel and Rose go on to justify digital censorship by saying that the wave of unfiltered information is bad for humanity and will ultimately slow down its evolution. They emphasize the need to contextualize history through filtration, editing out benign or false narratives in order to preserve what is true and, ultimately, what is most important. They say that the digital age has led to hypocrisy and made people soft and sensitive, that in a world where everybody has a voice, in a world where everyone's opinions and feelings matter, it creates an environment where people are unable to face reality, thus retreating into their own socio-political echo chambers, where, to quote the Colonel, no one is invalidated, but nobody is right. Ultimately, they believe that they must discard what is useless, while creating historic context and preserving only which is necessary, a task they deem the people unqualified to do for themselves. They even point out Ryan's hypocrisy when he tries to admonish them for this, when he says that he has the right to decide for himself what is true and what is false, what is real and what is fiction, by reminding him that he is simply parroting what Snake told him before the showdown with the Ray units, where Snake told Raiden to decide for himself what is real and what to pass on. However, this isn't what is really crazy. This is basically just an offshoot of what the Patriots are doing behind the scenes in the US, although theirs is more about absolute power and secrecy rather than culling information for the sake of it. What is crazy is what the Colonel and Rose reveal themselves to be. Remember, GW was destroyed, so how are they contacting him? Well, apparently, the AI Raiden was talking to was actually a base consciousness which was formed in the crucible of the White House over 200 years ago. A sort of formless being that began like a primordial soup, but which developed and evolved over time, becoming the rulers of the United States. Now, Kojima tried to contextualize this, all pun intended, in later games by explaining it away as an AI developed by a certain someone in a certain time and place, which I'm not going to reveal now because I'm only intent on spoiling one Metal Gear game today. However, nothing in the entire Metal Gear chronology can explain, justify, or rationalize the idea of GW, or whatever the hell Raiden has been speaking to, as some kind of underlying non-human, sentient entity which formed at the conception of the United States and grew to rule over the people, morphing them to think and act as they see fit. They even go as far as to say that the S3 plan, which, for the record, was one of the best, most ingenious feathers in Kojima's mostly exemplary storytelling cap, does not stand for Solid Snake Simulation, but actually stands for Selection for Societal Sanity, a program designed to control human will and consciousness. Now, let me start off with the good. First of all, the balls on Kojima for even trying something like this. I mean, even for him, this is pure, unadulterated madness. Secondly, the concepts of useless digital information, oversensitive communal echo chambers, and digital censorship was so far ahead of its time that it was actually eerie replaying it. At one point, Primordial Colonel even uses the phrase political correctness, which is such a pertinent and divisive issue in today's world, and which is exasperated massively due to the proliferation of widespread internet access and social media. Another thing I love about this is how they use the fact that Raiden's vitals are being monitored by the Patriots, or whatever it is that's watching him, and that his death would result in the death of Olga's child, and even Rose, assuming she exists. It's a brilliant and believable way of manipulating Raiden to fight Solidus to the death, while continuing to sow the seeds of self-doubt in Raiden's mind as to whether Rose was a Patriot spy, or whether she even exists, and as to what, if anything, is even real anymore. Now to the bad. Not only does the revelation of the Selection for Societal Sanity instantly nullify one of the best twists in the entire franchise in the form of the original S3 plan, but it actually makes little sense and just feels shoehorned in there. Even the name just sounds forced. It's ironic that this in-game plan of mass information filtration and historical contextualization is indicative of Kojima's writing at its most bloated, unedited, and contextually fallible. And again, I want to emphasize that at no point are these phantom AIs really fully explained at any point in the Metal Gear canon. Look, maybe they were and I just missed it. The lore is massive after all. If that's the case, feel free to leave a comment and explanation when, where, and how. But as far as I'm concerned, it's never been fully resolved, and remains a visible black eye on an otherwise ingenious story. Anyway, back to the gameplay, and MGS2 goes from strength to strength here, following up one of the better boss fights in the game with another one, especially after a string of somewhat lackluster encounters. The beauty of this is how the game strips down the combat to a sword duel, Solidus with his dual-wielding blades and Raiden with his HF blade. I already said how much I admired the developers for introducing a weapon which is so functionally sound and satisfying this late in the game, and it really justifies its place here. Naturally, Solidus doesn't just have the swords at his disposal. He can also skate around the rooftop at super speed, leaving a trail of fire in his wake that can ignite Raiden. He can also throw strikes at Raiden, which can deal significant damage and knock him off the rooftop. The boss fight does what every other good boss fight does, and that's escalate in terms of difficulty, dynamics, tension, and, in this case, narration, as you receive continued codec calls from the soup people taunting you. When it's all said and done, and you vanquish Solidus, two things occur. The first is that you finally engage in a boss fight which didn't just parallel one from Shadow Moses, but actually exceeded it, as I believe that this encounter is superior to Snake and Liquid's hand-to-hand duel at top Metal Gear Rex. The second is that it signifies the end of the game, introducing a cutscene and monologue which serves as one of the best, thought-provoking and damn near emotional, not just in the entire franchise, but in gaming period. After being defeated, Solidus falls from the roof of Federal Hall onto Wall Street below, where he lays dead. Suddenly, we cut to a shot of Raiden standing on the street, with people walking all around him, not looking at him in a skeleton suit, but just walking past him. When Raiden asks himself one simple question: who am I really? Out of nowhere, Snake appears and gives a somewhat rhetorical answer, saying no one really knows who or what they are. He then goes on to emphasize that our memories, real or imagined, define who and what we are, and that we can decide what to do with these memories and draw our own conclusions and shape our own morality from them. That whether the mission, and life in general, is real or virtual, is not the point. Raiden then throws his dog tags, complete with the name the player assigned him at the beginning of the game, into the mire of the crowd. An act which symbolises Raiden discarding the role he played as a Patriot's marionette and, perhaps in a meta sense, the one we forced him to play too. Bringing things back into focus, Snake then ensures Raiden that he will find Olga's child, and that he has a disc containing the names of the Patriots. The game would ultimately end with Otacon informing Snake that he found out who they are, and that they all died over 100 years ago in another moment of Kojima's shock value, seeking short-sightedness. However, I refuse to end the video on that note, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. After saying these words to Raiden, Snake literally vanishes, again reiterating the theme of solipsism. What is real? What is not? Snake's words are wise and profound, yes. But is this him manipulating his mind to calm him in the way that GW manipulated him to fight? Almost certainly not. But it all has the feeling of a fever dream, which not only suits the game thematically, but adds a tremendous sense of ambience. Then a second important character appears out of nowhere. Through the fog of the crowd, Rose appears, and implores Raiden to see her for who she is. But again, who is she really? Is she really a Patriot spy? Is she a figment of his imagination? I guess this is for Raiden to decide. It is then revealed that the two of them met each other at Federal Hall, and that April 30th is their anniversary, as well as being the 200th anniversary of George Washington's presidency, I guess. Anyway, it's then that the themes of reproduction and information are intertwined for the last time, when Raiden references Rose's baby. He regurgitates that passing on your genes is the only thing you can truly pass on, and as a parent, it is your duty to pass on your ideals, passions, and knowledge to your children. Fittingly, Snake has the final word. Spoken over sepia-tinged shots of New York City, Snake argues that there is more to life than passing on your DNA. There are emotions, ideals, film, music, and human history which need to be taught. And given his being a part of Les Enfants Terribles, this is what he has to pass on. This is what he lives for. His final words, which are, quote, "building the future and preserving the past are one and the same," are uttered with poise and wisdom by voice actor David Hayter, over a lingering shot of the Statue of Liberty, which, accompanied by the haunting piano melodies of Naruhiko Hibino's composition Who Am I Really?, fades to black. This ending cutscene is, for me, what Metal Gear Solid 2 is all about. I generally hate using the word art to describe media because I find the word pretentious. But in this case, I don't know what other word to use. No other ending in gaming history has had as profound an emotional impact on me as this. And over 2 decades later, its sentiments hit me harder than ever. There are few games, if any, that make more sense to you the older you get. The themes in MGS2 hit with more clarity and affect you on a deeper level with the passing of time. The ones that reaffirm the negatives in life sting a little more, while the ones that remind us of the beauty in life are that little bit more uplifting. This is the kind of thing we associate with groundbreaking albums and cinematic masterpieces, but very rarely with video games. In an art form where, let's be honest, most writers fail to succeed at crafting the most rudimentary of storytelling, Kojima succeeds at making the complex and esoteric captivating, the unbelievable believable, and the emotional compelling more often than he has any right to. So the occasional narrative discrepancy and moments of overindulgence aside, what ultimately shines through is his genius as a storyteller and his innovation and brilliance as a game designer. This is what makes Metal Gear Solid 2 one of the greatest games of all time. We can fawn over the revolutionary gameplay, exceptional sound design, pacing, character work and story. But the fact of the matter is that Metal Gear Solid 2 is a game that transcends video gaming. In short, Metal Gear Solid 2 is a masterpiece in any medium.